Hello everyone, welcome to this short video about the future of global supply chains. My name is Andrew Lahy and I've been working in global supply chains for over 20 years, and I personally believe there's never been a more exciting time to be working in global supply chains. So in this short video, what I'd like to do is to share some ideas about just some of the changes that we're already seeing in global supply chains, because there are already a number of changes that are already happening now, but also look at what future supply chains might look like. But before talking about changes and the future of global supply chains, I think it's worth just spending a couple of minutes talking about the history of global supply chains. Because, as someone famous once said, the best way to predict the future is to understand the past. So it's maybe interesting to note that the term supply chain is actually pretty new. So the term supply chain was only coined in the 1980s. But global supply chains are not that new at all. And in fact, global supply chains are as old as civilization itself. And I can recommend a book by Peter Frankopon, who explains how we've been trading and moving goods and money across the world, basically since the beginning of time. And just one good example of this is that it's known that people were moving goods across the Silk Road as early as the 1st century BC. Now you might ask, why are we talking about the 1st century Silk Road, and what does this have to do with predicting the future of global supply chains? But as we'll see later on, the future development of this historical Silk Road by the Chinese government is just one of the changes expected to have a major impact on the future of global supply chains. Now, although I've just said that global supply chains are as old as civilization, it's only really been in the last 70 years or so that we've seen a massive extension and expansion of global supply chains. And this graphic here just shows how much global supply chains have rocketed in the last 70 years or so. Now, what's also interesting in this graph is that, as well as this massive increase that we see here from the 1950s, is that in the last 10 years or so, we've seen some big dips, some changes, and some stabilization. And I think this is also a first indication that something is today changing in global supply chains. But before talking about what's changing, I'd like to go back and explain what drove this massive increase in global supply chains, to try and understand what might be changing now and also what might change in the future. So let's first look at what has driven an increase in global supply chains over the last 70 years. Now, I've broken the changes down into four main types: political, technological, business models, and societal changes. Probably the spark that initiated the huge growth in global supply chains was the signing of the GATT agreement in 1947. This is when governments started to formally work towards promoting global trade, and this appetite for global trade and this trend of globalization has continued and even accelerated further in 2001 when China joined the WTO. Another big enabler of global supply chains has been new technologies. And they say that the single biggest technological advancement in global supply chains was the invention of the global standard shipping container. And without this, arguably, global supply chains would not exist as they do today. Now, it's not just the technologies themselves, but also how companies have used these new technologies. And one nice example of a new business model that has accelerated global supply chains is FedEx. So in 1973, FedEx became the first company to offer dedicated airplane routes just for moving products and not focused on moving passengers. And then last but not least, we have the societal changes that have taken place. And I think one of the big changes came around in the 1960s when TVs became widespread. All of a sudden, consumers in one part of the world could see what products consumers in other parts of the world had, particularly consumers in the USA, and this drove global demand for these products all over the world. So These are some of the things that have driven massive growth in global supply chains in the past. And I think what I want to stress here is that there is no one technology or no one thing that's driven the growth in global supply chains. It's been a combination of many different factors. And I think now, as we now start to look at what will change in the future, it will continue to be a combination of factors that will drive changes in future global supply chains. So now we can start to look forwards and start to think about what changes might occur going forward. Again, let's start with political. And the obvious change we have today is growing nationalism and voters increasingly questioning the benefits of globalisation and global trade. Now, I've mentioned Brexit here, but the feelings of nationalism are growing in many parts of the world. USA, Hong Kong, Catalonia are just some examples. The second box here shows changing macroeconomic factors, and particularly equalisation of salaries across the world. Now, although there are still big differences in salaries between countries like the USA and China, it's clear that the differences today are nowhere near as large as they were in the past. And in any case, the importance of labour costs in manufacturing is decreasing. And this last box here goes back to the Silk Road that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And today, the Chinese government are investing trillions of dollars in a program called the Belt and Road Initiative to develop trade and supply chains along the traditional Silk Road. Now let's look at technologies, because I think there are some really exciting technologies that are already disrupting global supply chains. So the first is additive manufacturing, or 3D printing as it's also known. This is already starting to allow companies to design personalized products, move them around the world as a digital file, and then print or manufacture products on demand. Now, the next technologies that I've mentioned here are highly interlinked. So 5G is already being rolled out, and this will allow an even greater amount of sensors and data exchange between people and products, creating a new Internet of Things, and also enabling new blockchain type solutions that will eventually provide new levels of transparency in supply chains, particularly in regards of material and product provenance. But just as importantly, 5G, blockchain, and sensors will also allow the development of new smart contracts between suppliers and customers. And eventually, 5G will be the enabler for autonomous vehicles, which will, of course, massively reduce the cost of moving products from one location to another. And just as in the past, it's not just the technologies, but also new business models that make use of the technologies that will drive changes in global supply chains. We've already seen how Uber is disrupting the way that we move ourselves from location to location. And businesses like Uber are making people question whether they need to buy and own their car when they can click on a button and just get a lift whenever they need it. But it's not just in the consumer market where business models like this are being developed. There's a wider trend for companies to develop product as a service business models where consumers pay not to own a product but to use it, the service of using the product. And this example here is from Rolls-Royce, where they don't sell the engine, but they sell the service of providing power from the engine, the power by the hour business model, as they call it. And last but not least, we're also undergoing some major societal changes. So we now have a generation of consumers who expect that they can go online, find exactly the product they want, click a button, buy it, and have it delivered to them the next or even the same day. And what this means is that businesses can no longer monitor and react to trends over months, but rather they need to respond in a matter of days, or in this case here with Twitter, in a matter of hours. But on the other side, we also have this growing societal realization that our current manufacturing and global supply chains are simply not environmentally sustainable, and that we have to adapt and change them now in order to protect the future. Now, it's clear that these changes are already happening and already affecting global supply chains today. And I personally think that these changes will continue to drive development and change in global supply chains in the future. So we've looked at some of the changes that are happening, but now we can return to the specific question of what do we think supply chains of the future will look like? So, first of all, these are the main characteristics of global supply chains today. So, we have long, elongated supply chains where products are mainly bulk manufactured, usually in Asia or APAC, and then shipped across the world, usually by ocean freight. The products then sit in warehouses until you or I, as consumers, buy and own them. And these are the supply chains of the past, the traditional supply chains. But already we're seeing a move towards local distributed manufacturing models where products are manufactured much closer to local demand. There's also growing commercial focus on the opportunities in circular supply chains as companies look to repair, remanufacture, and reuse resources and products. Companies are also responding to our demands for increasingly personalized products. So we're seeing a shift to more modular and even personalized products. So an example of this is that it's now possible to go online, design your own trainer, which is then 3D printed and shipped direct, personalized to you. And then lastly, supply chains of the future will be less about just the selling, moving, and buying of a product. And they'll be more about providing a service which makes use of a product over a longer period of time. And all this should result in supply chains that focus on delivering a combination of products and services over an extended product lifecycle. Now, I know in this video we've only touched the surface of some of the changes going on in global supply chains. So, if you do want any more information, there's a lot of industry and academic publications available on the Park website. You can see the web address here. And this is an industry and academic institution that I am part of. And of course, there's a wealth of information on the SIPS website too. So, if you do want any more information about the ideas and the research provided here, you can contact me via my LinkedIn. Thank you very much.